So let's welcome our guest first. Please welcome back Schrader. Our next guest has an outstanding career in entertainment and media, having been the maths expert on Countdown. He said maths geek, sorry. The maths expert on Countdown on Channel 4 for the past decade. She has also found fame and recognition for a whole host of television work. Over the past few years, she's been at the front of standing up against anti-Semitism, particularly through social media, and not being afraid to call out anti-Jewish hatred. Her work in Holocaust education and countering anti-Semitism was recently recognised during the new year with an MBE being awarded by His Majesty the King. We're so honoured that she can join us again and being part of Swipe Up Rise Up last year. Please put your hands together for Rachel Riley. And our final guest is a Sunday Times best-selling author, comedian, satirist, social commentator and host of the wildly successful YouTube show. Born in the late Soviet Union and raised in Britain, he has appeared on flagship TV shows like BBC Question Time, Real Time with Bill Maher and Tucker Carlson, as well as the Joe Rogan Experience on other popular podcasts. He is a powerful speaker known for his engaging, entertaining and thought-provoking talks on a wide range of topics, including the importance of upholding Western values of liberalism, freedom of expression and viewpoint diversity. He's also spoken and written extensively about the war in Ukraine. His speech at an Oxford Union debate generated 100 million views around the world. He has made him one of the most sought-after cultural commentators in the world, and we're so grateful that he can join us today. Please put your hands together for Konstantin Kisin. Welcome. So before we take questions from the audience, I'm going to start with a question. It's an easy one. We have been, the last few months has seen an incredible rise in anti-Semitism. And there are those who wish to separate hatred of Jews with hatred of Israel. I was wondering how you think we, as a Jewish community, can counter that for people to understand that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are something that go hand in hand and can't be separated. So, Emily, I think I'll start with you and then we'll take a couple of minutes each, please.
So I think I actually addressed a lot of this in what I spoke about, but ultimately when you're talking about being anti-Zionist, you're not talking about being critical of Israel. You are talking about being against Jewish civil rights. And that's a very, very important distinction. And I think that the evidence of the connection between the obsessive hatred of Israel and the clear-cut anti-Semitism that we see in person today with Jews being attacked, being bullied, being harassed, even in the streets, is evidence of that. You don't need to be a genius to look around you internationally and see that Jews globally are being targeted as a result of what's happening in Gaza. And a huge part of that is social media. The ties are very, very clear. And for anyone who is skeptical of that, I'm happy to provide them with a very long list of different articles about attacks on Jewish individuals around the world in relation to freeing Palestine, okay? This is something that's very well documented, even in the international media, with all the challenges that we have there. And it's an unfortunate reality of what we're facing today. It's not right, it's not fair, but it is, frankly, if you look at the evidence all around you, undeniable that there is a connection between those two things.
Rachel, last year we spoke about how you kind of developed an even strong connection to your Jewish identity, and you saw that your connection with Israel was growing as a result as well. How do you view it, being British yourself, lived here your whole life, and seeing this incessant rise in anti-Semitism? How do you speak to someone about someone tries to separate the two?
This is on, isn't it? Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Is it working? Great. Well, I think the first thing, I'm a numbers person, so what surprised me, I went to a CST dinner recently, and you've probably heard about the huge rise in anti-Semitism recently, but what you might not know is that the biggest number of cases in a single week in Britain was the week following October 7th, before Israel had even responded. So before Israel had responded, there were 416 incidents of anti-Jewish hate here in Britain. That's got absolutely nothing to do with Israel. That was a celebration of Jews being attacked, raped, murdered, burned, kidnapped. And if you that stat alone, I think that tells you something. And actually, week on week, there's been fewer and fewer incidents. So that speaks for something. And I think I like resources. I think it's hard to put these arguments forward every single time. It's a lot of energy when there are some amazing podcasters that do it for us, or some amazing little videos, or whatever kind of thing will reach your audience. And there's one that I really enjoyed listening to. It was by Sam Harris, and he did 5 myths about Israel-Gaza war, Israel-Hamas war. And the clever thing that he did was he took Israel out of the equation entirely, because what's happened is everything to do with anti-Semitism and nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It is, if you took Israel out of the equation, Islamic extremists are killing Muslims, are killing Arabs, are killing Christians in Africa, they're killing people all around the world, nothing to do with Israel. So if you take Israel out of the equation, it doesn't exist anymore, you will have Islamic terrorism, and there's a fight in the Arab world of who wants to win that. And if people, I think a lot of people, they think they're on the side of human rights, but we need to show them that actually what you're supporting does not support human rights, and it's not, take Israel again out of the equation and look at the other Muslims, the other Arabs in that region, and think what would happen if Israel wasn't there, and try and, when they pull out these numbers from wherever, and you think it's just all a numbers game, if you look at the numbers of people killed by Islamic extremists, that's what you're talking about. It's those people that you're ignoring, it's those people that you are actively harming by ignoring that and supporting Hamas and Hamas's narratives.
Just want to add one more thing. Wow, this is really loud mic.
Yeah, I'm really quiet. You're really
I want to add one more thing to that. The majority of people who are victims of Islamic extremism are Muslims, mostly Arab Muslims. The majority of people killed by the Islamic Republic of Iran and all of their proxies, including Hamas, the majority of them are Arab Muslims. So when we're talking about this battle that you mentioned, it is far greater than just Israel.
Thank you. Konstantin, 2 areas. I mean, you grew up in Russia towards the fall of the Soviet Union, and you've lived here in Britain, I think, ever since. I think you were 10, I think you said you moved here?
Yeah, I moved here in 95.
95. And as well as in your own experience, maybe, I don't know if you witnessed anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union or witnessed the anti-Semitism that exists here, and particularly your recent experience, your very well documented talks at the rallies and the protests that you've actually got to speak to people that I think for many of the Jewish community we just see them almost hating us, but I think you kind of saw a slightly different point of view when you're able to have conversations with them. But do you think there's a way of having a conversation with someone who can't separate hatred of Israel and hatred of Jews? And we're trying to really make them understand that they work together, you can't actually do that.
Well, in terms of the videos I did going to various rallies, those people, they're kind of on the extreme ends. You're not really going to have much of a chance of persuading them. By the way, I'm a little bit Jewish. I would say I'm Jewish. So I kind of got a foot in both camps to some extent. And the one thing I would say is I know there's been a rise in anti-Semitic incidents. I don't think it's true that there's been a rise in anti-Semitism. I think what's happened is we've just realized how many anti-Semitic people there are in our society.
I agree.
We can talk a little bit more about why that is perhaps later. But in terms of persuading people, I think there's a few points. I actually think there are quite a lot of people who, because of the way social media now works, and you can open your phone and you see some of the worst horrors that human beings have ever inflicted on each other, it's quite natural for some people to go, well, I'm against this. And I think we ought not to overplay, actually, the idea that anyone who says, well, I don't think that should be happening, is anti-Semitic. I think we've got to be quite precise about what we're talking about. And I also think, by the way, Israel needs to do much better in terms of the information side of things and communicate the idea that, the way I think about it is, it doesn't really, how many people are being killed tragically in Gaza is not really the issue, or why, or whatever. What we should be talking about is whose responsibility is it that there's a war happening in Gaza, and working from that all the way through. So I think it's more about helping people understand why the conflict exists in the first place, and then this other stuff becomes easier to talk about, I think.
Thank you very much. We will have more discussions, but I think I want to give as much time as possible to our signals, because today this is for you. So our first question is from Benji Sharma. So Benji, put your hand up, and Daniel, fine.
Stuart.
It's a question for Konstantin. I saw your video when you went to the Palestinian march, and I was wondering, the people there, did you think they were anti-Semitic, or they knew what they stood for, they knew what was going on? Like, what were the people there like?
I thought it was kind of the way I describe it is a mixture of like hijabs and beards on the one hand and blue hair and nose piercings on the other. So it's a kind of mixture. There was a strong Islamic contingent. I don't know if it was Islamist. There were certainly some people who you might describe that way. And then there was just a lot of very clueless young people, which is not unusual for young people, no offense. But there were a lot of people who, just like we talked about, they just care, you know. And therefore, a lot of the things that they said or the placards that they held up, the moment you said, well, why, you know, what does that mean? They'd be like, oh yeah, I just got it from the stand over there, I have no idea. So there was someone there who had a placard saying, I believe in the socialist intifada. And when I asked him what a socialist intifada was, he had no idea what intifada meant. So there are a lot of people, this is why I was keen to make the point. I would say the vast majority of people actually at those protests, probably there to have a good time, meet someone of the opposite sex, that kind of thing. You know what I mean? And then there's a core, a harder core of people who probably are anti-Semitic. But I have to say, you know, compared to some of the earlier protests that had happened, I really didn't see a tremendous amount of like violent rhetoric or anything like that, which was reassuring actually, because I think some of the things we saw in the early days that you talk about, Rachel, particularly before Israel had even done anything, that was clearly just people who were motivated by hatred.
Thank you. Our next question is for Matteo. Matteo, over here. Right. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. So.
You can stand.
What's your response to people who say the Jews committed 9/11 and all these bizarre conspiracy theorists who are completely ignorant? Like, I saw recently people talking about the Moscow shooting and blaming Jews for it. What did you say to them?
I mean, I think as a person with a large following, I've got a responsibility not to amplify those people. I mean, I could spend my whole day. I actually have a friend, a really good friend, who thinks the world is flat. So I have experience. He's Russian. Might not surprise you.
We're not all the same.
And I, you know, experience arguing with a conspiracy theorist is they'll jump from one thing to one thing to one thing, and none of it makes sense, and everything's there to distract you. So I think, you know, some things are just not worth engaging with, because sometimes by engaging with them, you make them worthy of debate, and they don't deserve it. I mean, I've heard, you know, obviously we control the weather, so I don't know who made it rain today, but one of you here. I've heard that Jews are responsible for obesity in America because it was a Jew that designed the shopping trolley, and we're only designed to carry out food. You know, all kinds of absolute batshit stuff that aren't worth your time and effort. And I would put a lot of that alongside it and try not to give it any prominence.
I would add that I would add, it was too loud the first time, so they shut it off. I would add to that on social media, technically speaking, if you engage with that type of content, you actually are helping it spread further. So that is an example of where it would be unwise to engage on social media. That being said, sometimes it can't be helped. Sometimes you will encounter that in person or in, like, you know, I don't know, this week I had it with Abby Martin. Does anyone know who that is? She's like a virulent anti-Semite conspiracy theorist. So I debated her on Chris Morgan. I don't know why they invited her, because she's insane. But she also is a 9/11 truther, so that's what reminded me of that. And the thing is that when it comes to that, and you can't avoid some sort of altercation with those type of people, call them out on that, and call them out on the various conspiracy theories and how ridiculous they are, to undermine their credibility, because quite frankly, most of the things that they're saying are completely ridiculous and unfounded, and the majority of people, despite the challenges that we have, you know, with Israel's PR, the majority of people do recognize that a lot of these preposterous claims that they base their ideology on are exactly that.
I just wanted to reinforce what Rachel said, because I think one of the things your generation is really going to struggle with is you never had the thing that we had, which is a lack of social media. So what social media does is it creates the illusion that something is a big phenomenon, even if it's like 3 people in a basement saying this thing. And a lot of these ideas that you're talking about, they're really very, 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 very fringe ideas, which is why, unless you are in a debate format with somebody who's espousing them, I recommend putting it into context. There is always going to be stupid people in society. Thankfully, mercifully, they're a very small minority, and I wouldn't over-focus on them. You probably have better ways to spend your time doing productive things.
Off the back of Matteo's really good question, yesterday our organisation was kindly attacked by Professor David Miller, who hates Jews, but yet it's the most Jewish name possible. And he attacked, he used a photo, a better photo, he could have used a better photo of me, I think, but he attacked, Stand With Us, he attacked Jewish schools of being these sort of Zionist training camps where we're basically sending these guys to just go and take over the country and kill people. And he has a significant following, and and this is talking about social media. Obviously, we're all for free speech, but I think particularly on X, Twitter, I would say, it's got quite out of hand on that platform, that these sort of conspiracy theories are being plugged at people, and I know so many Jewish people who I think the algorithm is specifically targeting them with these conspiracy theories. So, ironically, in the last 24 hours, since being attacked by David Miller and seeing the David Miller stuff, my whole feed has been filled with these crazy conspiracies that ISIS stands for, is Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, which, if it's true, it's absolutely brilliant. Like, no one actually has thought about it until recently. But all these crazy conspiracy theories, and we're trying to have conversations, and this is another question that someone asked me before, is that we're an educational charity. We try and approach any single person in this country, regardless of their background, to have conversations with the truth. And frankly, I'll let you make your own opinion about how you think the conflict can be resolved without necessarily just attributing blame. What do you think, in all your expertise, how do you think that we, as our organisation, how these young people going into university, how can they use education in the correct way to engage people in these conversations, even those who might have crazy views?
Well, I think the young man, I've forgotten your name, sorry. He very good example of this, right? He was using, to some extent, what we call Socratic questioning, which is asking questions to lead a person. Showing that, I think, is powerful, and then humor as well, where that will play into it. So I think sometimes we get a little bit too outraged about things that are being said because they're worth being outraged about. They're terrible things that are being said. But the right response is that, the right response is making fun of it, the right response is sometimes ignoring it, and making great educational content as well. I think sometimes the answer is just to make really good content that people are going to want to watch. They're going to be curious about what happened on a protest march. That's why I go along and document some of them, that type of thing.
Itching to mic. So I can see here, Dov Foreman is in, so he's not shy, he's not shy. So I like Dov as someone that I so admire. So Dov's great-grandma is Lily Ebert, so she's 100 years old and she is a Holocaust survivor. All right, we're not going to speak for long, so please. There you go. I'm not a school teacher, but I will shout. I'm from Essex, so I can get Larry. So I think one of the most important mistakes we make, and one of the most brilliant things that Dov does, is he frames his own story. So the message he wants to tell people, he tells it from his framing. What we can do is spend our whole entire lives arguing that we didn't create ISIS, and all we are doing is going down a rabbit hole and spreading the idea that we created ISIS. You know, trying to prove something false, that's clearly false, that has no evidence, will take all your energy, and it's far, far, far better to tell the story that you want to tell from your own framework. There's something called the chocolate teapot. So Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, said, you know, there could be a chocolate teapot orbiting the Earth. Try and prove it isn't. You know, you can just make anything up and spend your whole life trying to prove that it isn't. But you could otherwise, you know, just focus on the story you want to tell. You don't want to focus on Holocaust deniers, you want to focus on the amazing Lily and her survival and her family story. That's just one example.
So I agree with both of what you said, but I also want to add one more facet, and that is that I think we need to fight back. First of all, we need to set our own narrative, exactly as you said, not go with the narrative of the others and respond to every single accusation. But at the same time, I think a lot of the blatant anti-Semitism, the more aggressive incidents, the more aggressive claims and rhetoric, especially on social media that are made, no one is held accountable for these things. Some of the incidents that have happened in universities, no one has been held accountable for them. And it is going to get worse until it is deterred. That's how it works. And I was speaking to Josh actually about this, but the response to some of the increase in anti-Semitism on campuses and the threats against Jews has been to increase security for Jewish communities and have private security and police and all these people prepare so that all the Jewish community is protected. That's important, but not the answer. The answer is holding the perpetrators accountable. And our role in that isn't to be the police, but our role in that is to expose when this is happening and to not be silent and to not let these things go when these incidents happen, because it wouldn't be ignored if it was against any other minority group. So why is it acceptable? Why is it brushed under the, swept under the rug when it comes to the Jewish community? And this is something that we have seen in Australia. It's something we've seen in the United States and Canada and here. It's not acceptable, and we should not be silent about it, and we shouldn't be ashamed to speak out about it and to make a big deal out of it, because frankly, what the other side is doing when it comes to this issue is making a big deal out of things, in some cases, that never even happened. We have a legitimate case to be made to push back against anti-Semitism, and we are not firm enough in our response, and we have to be unafraid to speak out and to push back against that whenever and wherever possible.
Thank you. Our next question is from Josh Rosenthal. Josh, where's your hand up, please? Where is he? Oh, there you are. Right in front. Josh.
Other than education, how can we best fight anti-Semitism?
Well, this is where it gets controversial, but you have to fight anything, you have to understand where it's coming from. And anti-Semitism comes from different places. There is when we think of the Holocaust, we think of the far right, the Nazis. And in the UK at the moment, there is, I would say, a very minor, but quite dangerous group of people who are of that worldview. They're not a large group of people, but because of the type of people they are, they're quite dangerous. But they're a very small group of people, and they enjoy no public support whatsoever. And realistically, to fight that kind of anti-Semitism, you really just need the police to do their job, basically, right? To lock up people who are violent. Then you have the fact that, forgive me, but if you import tens of thousands of people every year from places where hating Jews is taught at school, shown on TV, and people are indoctrinated into that from a young age, there is no social media campaign, there's nothing Rachel, I, and Emily can do, or you guys can do, to stop anti-Semitism if you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people coming from cultures where that is normal. So part of the solution is to have to advocate for, and I know you guys are not in charge of the government, but at some point some of you will be in charge of the media, the government, the whatever, and that's why I'm saying it now. You cannot have the kind of immigration policy we currently have and stop anti-Semitism. It's not possible. It's actually not possible. And then the third thing is, you have anti-Semitism that I think is the most prevalent. It's certainly the type of anti-Semitism I saw on the marches that I attended, which is a kind of anti-Semitism from the left. And that is anti-Semitism which says, well, look at the Jews, they're overrepresented in all sorts of things. They do well, and because of the way our society now treats underperforming minorities and overperforming minorities, because we've imbibed this idea that rather than looking at each other as individuals, which is the Martin Luther King dream that my generation was raised on, we must obsess endlessly about everybody's identity. Oh, you're a woman, therefore this, you're a man, therefore that, you're black, therefore this, you're Jewish, therefore that. Then people start to ask questions, because the Jews are kind of a big problem for people who think in this way, because for various cultural, historical, and other reasons, Jews tend to, quote-unquote, overperform and be overrepresented in certain sectors. So the way you fight all of those is different. And on that one, I would say the way you fight that is you have to come back to the idea that people should be treated on the content of their character. That is something our society is really not doing at the moment. And so this identitarian crap from both left and right is something that we actually have to reject completely.
Yeah, I mean, what else to add to that? That was spot on. Social media for me is the breeding ground for these ideas, for this misinformation. I'm old, I'm not on TikTok. I can't speak to people of your generation. You can speak to people of your generation. Dov is on TikTok. Dov can speak to people of his generation. You know, we need to be innovative. We need to be creative. I think what Emily said earlier was absolutely spot on. You don't have to do it with your own profile. I wouldn't recommend it, quite frankly, in this climate. But we do need bodies. We do need likes. We do need numbers. And I think, you know, as a public figure, I think I've got there's two roles. There's two jobs to be done. There's educating the wider public on what is anti-Semitism, on what is misinformation. But there's also a really big job of educating ourselves, because there's nothing inherently about being Jewish or having Jewish heritage or anything like that that means you understand your history or you understand any of the nonsense coming out of anti-Semites' mouths. So you can take whichever role you want, but I think there's a proper place for, even if it's not your identity, just having an anonymous account and collating good bits of information and supporting people who are sharing it, and supporting especially Arab voices, women's voices who have, you know, they've lived through Islamic extremism, they've escaped, they don't want to live in these countries. Sharing them, propping them up, and giving them a platform, and finding these allies, I think is really important, because a lot of these people, like Konstantin was talking about, that just want to help, they need an option, they need another option. And they need to see, you know, this isn't all bad, this is good or bad, this black and white thing's nonsense. They need an option of what they can put their energy into that will make the world a better place. Sound a bit miserable?
I think one of the goals of anti-Semitism, particularly online, is to silence Jewish voices and pro-Israel voices. And in some ways they've been effective, because a lot of the reactions that I get from students especially is like, well, I don't want to be there, it's such a mess, everybody's awful on there, which is precisely why we need to be there. So how can we fight anti-Semitism beyond just the educational aspect? I think a lot of the stuff beyond education is actually out of your hands, at least for now, but in the future, as you mentioned, legal. I think that in most Western democratic countries, you have legal options and resources available, whether to you as an individual if you are a victim, or in general. And these organizations, individuals, universities, sometimes government officials, they need to be held accountable. And there is a way to do that. It may be expensive, it may take time, but this is important to do, because we need to send a message that this type of behavior, this targeting and harassment and even attacks of Jewish individuals for this, you know, Palestinian, what they call Palestinian advocacy, is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. And that can't be done if there aren't consequences. And I don't mean go attack anyone, certainly don't be violent, but there do need to be consequences for these types of actions. And so beyond the educational aspect, how do we fight anti-Semitism? Legal. We need to hold people accountable on that front. And that is, I think, one of the most important steps that's missing right now from this equation, because they think they can get away with this type of behavior because they have. And Western democracies have failed in this regard because of this sort of commitment to what they perceive as I guess, wokeism, which doesn't really make sense, because even by that ideology, technically they should be protecting minorities, but that's not what's happening because of, you know, how we view certain minorities who are overrepresented in positive ways. The Asian community, for example, in America has positive stereotypes and faces some of the similar things. If you view everything in this equation of someone as good or bad based on their identity, you're missing the point. You're missing the point, and that's not how we should be looking at the world. And I think one of the best ways to push back against that, not just on the anti-Semitism issue, but especially on the anti-Semitism issue, is with legal recourse.
Thank you. Before we take more questions, I just want to highlight, you were talking about being silenced, we're talking about how, whilst anti-Semitism is quite fringe, we've known, for me, the most alarming thing, and I've experienced anti-Semitism for many years, so I sort of take it, but when I see it infecting areas of our society, particularly our politics and our leadership, so we're very grateful that Mike Freer, MP, for finishing Golden Screen is here with us today. Mr. Freer has served his constituency for many years, has been a strong supporter of the Jewish community, has been a strong supporter of Israel, but ultimately there was an unacceptable behaviour from this fringe that has made not just Mr. Freer but other MPs, and we saw the absolute commotion a few weeks ago when the whole motion issue in the Commons, and the Speaker of the House said, I had to change something because the public mob is actually threatening our MPs. How can we reassure not just the Jewish community, but how can we kind of wake up the rest of this country that our own democracy is under attack, that our MPs cannot make decisions properly unless they're under threat? So I think Konstantin wants to go first.
Well, I wish I had a good answer. First of all, I salute your courage, Mike, and I wrote a piece when you announced that you wouldn't be standing again talking about this, because to me, the most troubling thing is actually the reaction of your colleagues, which was the same reaction we saw after the murder of Sir David Ames, which is to pretend that the reason you resigned was the MPs weren't nice enough to each other on online harm or whatever. So there's only one way that I see it, which is you have to start being honest about where this is coming from. And this is why I made the point that if you continue to have hundreds of thousands of people come into this country who hate Jews, you can talk all you want about anti-Semitism, you're not going to fix it. And the fact is, the most virulent and violent rhetoric and frankly behavior is coming from Islamists. And MPs don't want to say it because they're afraid, understandably so, but that's where it's all coming from. And until they're willing to deal with that issue, we're going to be where we are.
I want to take more questions from the audience, so hands up now if you have a question for any of our panelists. Please, let's try to stick it to the topic. Yes, you over there. So Mike's coming to you quickly. Put your hand up. Daniel's going to find you. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dylan. Generally, I find myself a fairly socially liberal person, so myself and Konstantin will probably disagree on a couple of things. But since October 7th, I find myself naturally affiliating more with sort of Konstantin's crowd himself, Douglas Murray, even people like Ben Shapiro that I can't imagine myself a year ago getting up and applauding for, and yet now here I am. But how do we stop ourselves from getting to a place where we ally ourselves with not particularly tasteful people in the name of preventing anti-Semitism? Tommy Robinson showing up to anti-Semitism marches is not a good look.
Well, just to start with, it's definitely not. He was asked by the organisers of that march not to come, and when he came, he was removed. So I couldn't agree more. I just think it's really hard these days to work out who is, in quote-unquote, a goodie and who is a baddie, because if you read my detractors, I'm a Nazi, genocidal, loving, white supremacist. So I think you just have to use your own judgment. I think that was something, that's got lost in somewhere, that you have to trust yourself and use your own judgment. And I think social media has made it that we have to agree with every single thing that one person says, otherwise we have to reject them entirely. And I think that's groupthink, and I think that's why we've got ourselves into this mess. So I think you just have to have strong personal courage and conviction and make your own decisions.
Well, first of all, I'm socially liberal too, actually. But as you say, once your social liberalism clashes with reality, then you start to change your mind. And so when I was your age, I was also probably as socially liberal as you are. I just think the reality of it is, given the nature of the problem, I understand that there will always be, I mean, it's like if you had a protest against Israel, which you now do, against Israeli genocide, quote unquote, there would be some unsavory people that turned up to that as well. To me, I don't think that's really that important. I think the issue is what is the truth of the issues. I think, many of you probably know Bella Wallersteiner. She's very prominent on social media talking about anti-Semitism at these marches. She used to go along and document stuff. And her and I used to argue all the time about immigration. Well, after October 7th, she's come around to my position. So I trust you will as well.
I do think it's really important to speak out where you differentiate from people who may be agreeing with you on certain policies. That being said, we live in a time where there's sort of this ideological line where people feel like they can't associate with people who they strongly disagree with or even find some of their views abhorrent. At the same time, we need to be able to talk to people who are different than us. And I'll actually give you an example that's not related to this conflict, but related to another conflict. The Iranian diaspora has a very fierce debate between monarchists and those who want some sort of liberal society. And they, much like the internal Jewish community when we have debates, are kind of at each other's throats sometimes, to the point where it's detrimental to their cause of overthrowing the regime. This is not healthy. We need to be able to find common ground with people who are different than us, who we disagree with, who we strongly disagree with on certain ideas. And just because someone aligns themselves with a certain view that we have doesn't mean that everything about that view is evil. A broken clock is right twice a day, you know? But you should also feel comfortable, when appropriate, based on your judgment, calling out where you disagree. That's entirely appropriate and worthy of conversation. But it should be framed as that. I mean, you don't need to attack people unnecessarily, but if there's an opportunity to advance dialogue or advance understanding on something, whether publicly about those individuals or with those individuals directly, it's worth doing, and it should be done. But don't be afraid to say something is true if it's really true just because someone we very much disagree with says it as well.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes, Ms. Gill. So, got a mic for you. No, that's very kind of you. I saw someone else put their hand up. That's very kind of you. Yes, yeah, over there. Yeah, the girl with the left hand up. It's a good one. Daniel, take her first, and then we'll take Sheila's question. And then we'll take Sheila's question. Don't worry, we've got time. Don't worry. Thank you. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Vanessa. My question is for Rachel. You obviously work with Channel 4, or like you did work with Channel 4, and they're like known for being very diverse or anything. But if the BBC wanted to work with you, would you say like yes or no? Because obviously they're very anti-Semitic.
Well, you know, the BBC is a huge organisation, so I wouldn't call all the BBC anti-Semitic. There are still loads of Jews there, and thank God there are still loads of Jews there. I definitely have my own issues with BBC News and its anti-Israel bias. But, you know, in October, I don't know, 20th, something around then, I went on BBC, I think it was Newsnight, and shamed the BBC for refusing to call Hamas terrorists. And what better platform to go on and criticise the BBC than the BBC? So I think, you know, some of the best places where you can get your voices heard are with people that disagree with you, because preaching to the choir is one thing, but, you know, I know a lot of people who would absolutely love to get their pieces into The Guardian. When the New York Times finally reported about the sexual violence that women faced on October 7th, that was a significant thing, because so many people in the New York Times didn't want that reported. And people who are so staunchly anti-Israel finally saying, yes, this happened, that's significant. So I think it's actually quite important to go to places where you disagree to get your voice heard.
It was a question for you.
Sheila.
I go on the BBC all the time and do the same thing.
Sheila.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Sheila Giewolb. I run I'm chair of the Board of Deputies Outreach Education Working Group. Yeah, so it's a question for Konstantin. I speak to lots of young Jewish people who live in non-Jewish areas who have been told to hide their identity when they come to London because there'll be trouble. And I want to know your response, please, to, you told us that a lot of the hate marches are full of people who don't really understand what they're there for. How do you explain to people who are frightened to go into those areas who are Jewish at certain times, as sort of no-go zones, that there are people there who don't really hate you and have not really know what they're supporting? How do you explain to those people not to be intimidated, please?
Oh, well, I certainly wouldn't explain that at all. What I was saying is, I mean, two things can be true at once. The vast majority of people at a protest could be not hateful or anti-Semitic, while some of them could be hateful and anti-Semitic. And I think that's what you're talking about. So nothing I've said, I hope, was communicated in a way to say there are no anti-Semitic incidents, which I think we clearly know that there are. It's a tragedy what has happened in this country. That, of course, we care about the Jewish community, but the fact that people of any background in this country fear walking around the streets of this country, actually to me is even more troubling, because it just tells you about the state of Britain. And the fact that there are people who are being targeted for their religious or ethnic background, with kind of a blind eye being turned, frankly, I think, by some people in the media, some people in positions of power. It's very, very bad. So I certainly wasn't suggesting that isn't happening. Yeah.
Any further questions? Yes, just over here. Daniel, just over here. No, here. Don't worry.
Such an opinion.
I'm in charge.
Hello, I am Ariel, and this is a question for Konstantin. What do you think of Queers for Palestine?
Straight to the point, thank you. Everyone can answer that.
I did jokingly suggest that we should start a campaign for one-way flights to Palestine for anyone.
I'll donate.
Yes, me too. We could probably raise enough money for that. But to be serious, I think it shows you what I was saying earlier, which is so many people who go along to these protests and who are supportive, they don't really know anything about the thing that they're talking about.
Actually, just kind of a tactic. So I kind of joined the anti-Semitism fight in the Corbyn years, and one of the most powerful videos I saw was, I think it was Joseph from the Israel Advocacy Movement, who went to a bunch of Corbyn lovers with placards and read them a bunch of anti-Semitic things that the Conservatives had said, and got their reaction on camera, and they were appalled. And then he told them, actually, no, that was your mate who said that. And again, I did the same thing. There was a Jewish, I think it might have been at Leeds University, a football team who the Arab equivalent team refused to play them, and I posted it, and I linked the real story, but I twisted it. It's not racist for Jews to refuse to play Arabs because they might be terrorists. Believe me, all the terrorist lovers realised that was racist. I got so much abuse saying that was racist, even though in the same thread of the same post at the same time, I actually said this is actually what happened, and it was the reverse. So, for people who just say, they're queers for Palestine, ask them what they, about the facts without placing Israel or a country or whatever, and see what they really think of that, and then, get a little crack in their brain going. There's a brilliant woman. Her name's fallen out of my head now. She's part of the Methodist Baptist. The church in America who just protested, fags are evil, and she did the podcast with J.K. Rowling. Thank you, the Westboro Baptist Church. And she's written a book, and she was actually, she was indoctrinated with this church, with this bonkers ideology, and it was actually someone who put that tiny little crack, who spoke to her and asked her questions and planted that tiny seed of doubt, which made her whole life and her whole family and her whole belief system fall away. So it can be done. Just a tiny way to do it.
Just very briefly, I think the whole Queers for Palestine movement is a result, it's a byproduct of the misrepresentation of the entire conflict, of people thinking that this is about Israel and Palestinians versus the much bigger picture, which is that right now, at least, this particular war is Israel versus an Islamist terrorist organization that is funded and supported by the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has an agenda to destroy this country, as well as all of Europe, as well as the United States and Canada, and all the Western world. And that people need to zoom out a little bit in these groups and see that the conflict, it isn't specific to Israel-Palestine. It is much, much greater than that, and the threat is much, much greater than that. And when we are so myopic and we focus only on the, oh, well, how much aid is getting into Gaza, you're missing the point. And that's something that needs to be pointed out creatively and cleverly, as an example that you gave on social media if possible, but also in everyday conversation when you encounter these people.
So we will have time afterwards if you want to ask questions, but we are out of time. I do want to have one question that has been asked a lot of Stand With Us, I think, in the community. Whether or not the community has been afraid. A lot of people in the community have been afraid. A lot of people are trying, there's an argument within the community of how afraid should we be, but I genuinely didn't think in my lifetime that I would have close relatives, people who are so proud of their Judaism asking me, Yehuda, you work for Stand With Us, do you think it's safe for me to have my mezuzah up on my doorpost? Yehuda, do you think that we should consider making plans to go live in Israel? One country, not anywhere else. I'm not going to go to America, I'm not going to go to Australia, I'm going to go to that one country where the war's taking place. I've got family in Israel during the war saying, it's looking pretty bad in London. Like, you're in a bomb shelter sending me this. Like, I don't really like using the word hope all the time because I don't think it's always an optimistic word. But what message do you have for this young community that this country is still very much a place for them and the Jewish community can still continue to thrive? What's your message to them as we finish off? From each of you.
It's a bit of a big one.
I know.
Optimism from Jews. Wow, this is an ask. I mean, I'm British. I'm 100% British. I'm not Israeli. I support Israel in their fight against Hamas, and I support getting the hostages home and our right to defend ourselves as Jewish people, to live as Jews. But I'm British. This is where my home is, this is where my family is, and I'm going to stay and fight. And I think we look outside of Britain. I think because, you know, as an island, we've been lucky enough to have democracy and peace for so long that actually the younger generation take it for granted. And I think we just really need to look outside of Jewish history to give us more perspective. I mean, I think your generation, I remember exactly where I was as a schoolgirl when the planes flew into the Twin Towers. And I remember people in real time seeing people jump out of buildings. And I've seen in recent months, because of what's going on with Israel and Hamas, your generation going on TikTok and saying, I was wrong about Osama bin Laden. We have to fight for liberal democracy. We have to fight for truth. And I say this with not facetiously in the slightest, but if this can rehabilitate Osama bin Laden, then the next they're going to be looking at the Nazis, because the Nazis had their reasons. So, you know, was I supposed to be optimistic? Yeah. I think my message is to fight. Things are crap. You know, it was Purim last week. They tried to kill us. They failed. Let's eat. Like, we're gonna eat again. They're gonna fail again. But we have to fight for it. This is our shift. So just be courageous and give strength to each other.
I'm from Russia, so I should definitely not be last, because I don't know how optimistic or positive this is going to be. But no, I think the one thing I think we can say, and actually our conversation with the young man over there symbolizes it, in some ways the worse things get, the more people wake up to the reality of what's going on. And I think we have seen a lot of that, a lot of moderate, sensible people who prior to this would have just stayed out of it, now starting to realize actually where we are. So I think, first of all, the worse things get, the more people wake up. The second thing, I just reiterate this. What you see on your social media is not reality. What I saw at those protests is a bunch of people who are not representative of this country. That doesn't mean there won't be situations that you talk about where people are targeted and terrible things happen, and that's terrible that they do. But we should just keep in mind that the ordinary British person is thoroughly decent, is not anti-Semitic, and frankly is against any of that, and will be against people who engage in violent rhetoric, because it's a very un-British thing to do, frankly. This is just not how we are. So I think we are naturally going to focus on terrible things that are happening, but the worse things get, I think the more people will realize where we are, and then we're going to start to see pushback. And the most effective pushback against anti-Semitism is not actually going to come from the Jewish community. It's going to come when ordinary people in Britain go, hold on a second, and you've gone too far here, like we can't tolerate this. And I think we are starting to see quite a lot of that happen. So that's where I think there's some optimism.
Thank you. Emily?
So I agree with what you said, and I want to give an example actually from Israel. A lot of people thought after the war in 2021 that there were these huge divides between the Arab-Israeli community and the Jewish community inside of Israel. And there is a small faction that exists within Israel that is quite problematic, that is very anti-Israel. But what we saw after October 7th was a stunning rise in solidarity and identification as Israeli from the Arab-Israeli community at levels we've never seen before. There are Arabs now who are fighting in Gaza against Hamas, more so than ever before. Every year there are more Arab Israelis who serve in the IDF. And there are more people waking up to the threat inside of Israel of Islamist terrorism. And it's true, the worse that things get, the more people are waking up. And I want to say for your case, for what's happening in the UK, I'm sure that it feels very overwhelming. I've been here just under a week and I'm overwhelmed. I was just telling both of them before how crazy I think it is here with the extremism. But you're not alone. You're not alone. And there are more people than ever before who are responding. I mean, even looking at some of the news this morning from different UK sources, I was reading through the comments, and people are seeing what's happening more than ever before. People are starting to wake up, and you have other communities, even other minorities communities. The Indian community is being more vocal. The Iranian community has been at the forefront of these issues globally because they understand, perhaps more than any other group, you're not alone. There are a lot of people who are standing with us, who are fighting with us, and the more we raise awareness about this issue, the more we reach out and we build bridges with other communities, whether in times of war or in times of peace, the more effective it's going to be in the longer term. And the more people are going to understand that this fight isn't just our fight, it's the fight of the whole country. It's the fight of the whole Western world. It's the fight for liberal democracies and for freedom of speech and for freedom of expression and for all of these values that we cherish and hold dear. And we are not alone, and we will continue to fight until we win.
So, thank you very much to each one of you for coming and joining us, supporting these students. As for coming here, we do have gifts for all of you. As a thanks, we've got a little miniature figure of an Israeli icon. So first for Emily, we have an icon of Geula Cohen. Geula Cohen is a former gunfighter. She was a journalist, a radio broadcaster, and a feminist icon of Israel. So that'll be for you. So Hannah, for Emily, thank you very much. Rachel, we got you something called Rachel. Rachel the poetess. Rachel is a Zionist pioneer whose poems have really captured the hearts of Israel. This is for you. That's Rachel the poetess. And for you, Konstantin, we've got the icon himself, Theodor Herzl. We all know who Theodor Herzl really woke our Jewish community up. I would say he was woke. He said that if you will it is no dream. He made a dream a reality, so I thought it would be very appropriate. So thank you very much.